here it was personal. It was people dragged out of their beds, and burned alive, and shot and tortured and raped. Um, Defenseless kids at a concert. They just walked in, and it was the Hunger Games. It was human hunting on a very, very personal, very, very wide, broad level.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining me for the second episode of the Tell Me Más podcast. Before I get into who I'll be talking to today, just wanted to give everyone a true thank you for being so supportive. I've read so many of your words of encouragement. Thank you for reaching out, for your comments. Really do hope that you enjoyed that interview with Cain Velasquez. Today, I have the very distinct pleasure of interviewing someone I've been friends with for quite a while who does some really important work. His name is Tony Hernández, and he's the founder of the Immigrant Archive Project, a project whose mission is to capture and archive the stories of immigrants, how they came to arrive here in the United States, and how they've contributed to the fabric of our country. Very important to me, obviously, because my parents are South American immigrants, so I think that these are stories that are important to capture, and they're so important that the Library of Congress has actually included them in their archives, and that will live in posterity forever, basically. So, very important work. Tony has also done an amazing job in a project that I was really surprised to hear about a few months back. But he spent an entire month in Israel interviewing Latino Israelis, which is a group of people I knew very little about, if anything, and they were all directly affected by the attacks on October 7th. So he's brought back just some amazing stories, and he is currently editing all that footage for release later this year. And we've got a couple trailers here in the podcast. So definitely some amazing stories there. Thank you so much for all of your support once more, and I hope you enjoy this interview. Thank you. Tony Hernandez, how are you, my brother?
Fantastic, my dude. Good to be here with you. Thank you.
So great to see you, man, as always, and really appreciate you. Know you're busy as hell right now, but thanks so much for giving me the time to, have you on as a guest of this new little adventure of mine. I've been wanting to
I
do it for
love it.
years.
I love it. I love it. I love it. Glad to be a part of it. Thank you for having me on. I appreciate it.
Absolutely, man. Yeah, so ton of stuff, that I want to cover. Certainly, really want to dig into your latest project, which is terribly, important for sure. But I'd love to take a little step back. You know,
Uh-huh.
you know, you've been in, the business for so long now. Truly, you are now a documentarian, and you founded the Immigrant Archive Project. And funny enough, what do you call that when everything just kind of comes around?
Comes around full
But
circle, right?
for
Yeah.
full circle moment for me, we
Yeah.
met 14 years ago when I hosted you on a podcast at the ad agency I was working on way back when. And so now we're doing this, and you came in to talk about the Immigrant Archive Project. I don't exactly recall exactly how old it was at that time, but give us current status of that project. Especially given the fact that it's now archived in the Library of Congress.
That it is. That it is. It sounds crazy that it's been 14 years since we had that that conversation that sort of brought us together, and obviously full disclosure here, we've been friends ever since.
Good.
But for some reason, it also feels like I've known you for a lot more than just 14 years. You know.
For
Um,
sure.
yeah. 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 So where the project is now, yeah. So 14 years ago, I guess the project was into its second year at the time. Um, and yeah, what we've done is we've dedicated a tremendous portion of our resources to documenting immigrant stories here in the U.S. And immigrant stories of all nationalities, all walks of life. Right? You've got the rich and famous in there, and you've got migrant farm workers and factory workers, like my folks were when they work. Now they're very happily retired. But just a snapshot of the immigrant experience in this point in time in the country's history. And I felt that it was important to document because having lived that immigrant experience, having gone through that journey, It was a beautiful journey. Learned an awful lot from it. There was a lot of sort of the beautiful side of our shared humanity throughout. And yet at the time, I saw that immigrants were being scapegoated for a number of things, right? And it just didn't sort of jive with what my reality had been. I was hearing from people on cable news shows that weren't immigrants and certainly hadn't grown up in immigrant neighborhoods, and what they were describing couldn't have been any further from the truth.
Oh,
So when
wow, and it's improved so much now. We're in 2024, that issue has now been completely resolved, you know?
it's sort of part of our original sin. It's like immigration and racism are the two things we can't get past.
No.
And it's been happening forever. I can't think of one major immigrant group that hasn't been met with tremendous resistance. Ben Franklin wrote that you need to be careful with the Germans, right? If we're not careful, they're going to completely change our way of life. And today, more Americans trace their lineage back to Germany than any other group. And they didn't destroy the country. And
Right.
when the Irish arrived, oh my gosh, the Irish, what a problem they are, this
Correct.
mongrel race. I mean, geez, if you can, think about that.
Man.
And today, you hear bagpipes play outside of a church after a wedding, which was the case when I got married back in 1989 to an Irish American woman. That was as American as it gets, right? Some blonde haired dudes playing bagpipes outside of a wedding. So each immigrant groups, whether it's the Jews, whether it's the Irish, the Italians, I mean, the Italians weren't considered white until not that long ago.
Right. Right.
Um, and it's a thing. It's a thing. And today, when you think immigration, you tend to think Latino immigrants, and for some reason, we're sort of odd man out. And part of the reason I created the project was in the hopes that in the future, your grandchildren and my grandchildren don't become the oppressors of the next immigrant wave, which may not speak Spanish, more than likely will come from another corner of the world. And we're not as fearful of them as perhaps some of our neighbors are of Spanish speaking immigrants today.
Yeah, no, it is. It's an important story for sure to archive, especially when there's just so much misinformation. Like right now, you hear so much about, all of these people coming over the border and the crime that they're contributing to, when every source out there has made it absolutely clear that immigrants are far less likely to commit crimes than those that are native born, and so,
By like a factor of 8 to 10
and
less likely, immigrants of the same age, right? The majority of folks incarcerated today are young men between the ages of 18 and 34. So even if you take a look at that snapshot, 18 to 34, immigrants are far less likely to be incarcerated, and undocumented immigrants are even less likely to be incarcerated than
right.
quote unquote legal immigrants, right? Those that have got their documentation in place. So yeah, there's so much misinformation, and as we know, and it's been proven throughout history, that once you label any group other, they can become targets for for violence, for a number of negative issues, let's say, and we've seen that play out.
Correct. Correct. So tell me, when was it? When was the archive actually submitted to the Library of Congress or entered?
Yeah, that whole thing kind of caught me by surprise. I'd always wanted to do something bigger than just have it housed within a website that we created. Shameless plug here, Immigrant Archive Project.org.
Of course.
The idea was if folks are sitting on camera and sharing their life story with us, it was incumbent upon us to do something meaningful with it. And we've done a few things, right? I mean, we've brought these to television, we've brought them to network radio, we've a number of Fortune 100 companies have supported us and included our content in their campaigns, but yet still that was never really enough. But I didn't, my strengths aren't within that space, right? And one day I received an email And between you and I literally thought I was being punked by a friend of mine. That's what I thought. That was my initial reaction, right? I
Right,
went
right.
back to being that kid in Union City, New Jersey, thinking, wait a second, this can't be real. I know it, in fact, was from the Library of Congress. They stumbled upon the work, and they considered it to be of significant value, both culturally and historically to the nation. And they asked our permission to archive all of our stories. So since that day, everything that we've shot and anything that we will shoot will be at the Library of Congress and housed there in perpetuity, which is
Ah,
just yeah. It's sort of
that's
a
amazing, truly. Now, if we
highly
can,
milestone kind of moment for us. Yeah.
for sure, and if we can just get some members of Congress to actually read in a library, that would be pretty good. Or I'm not really sure
Or
how
just
many of
read
those do
anywhere.
that.
Or
Or
just
walk in and watch a few of the videos for sure. That's great. So remind me, Tony, give me your immigrant path. I know you're Cuban American, but I'd love to hear that story again, and how you ultimately became the weirdest thing in the world, which is a Cuban college football player at Wisconsin.
yeah. It was weird back in 1980. I got to be
It's
honest with
still
you.
weird now, yeah.
Now you look at, you watch games on television, be it college or in the pro ranks, and you see quite a few last names that end in Z. Back then, that was
Sure.
not the case.
No,
You didn't see
absolutely.
people that looked like you and I on a football field. It was kind of weird. But yeah, my immigrant experience, technically I'm a political refugee rather than an immigrant.
Okay.
My family left Cuba in the fall of 1967, 8 years after Castro came to power, and 5 years after I had been born. And by then, things already on the island had become, particularly dark. Right? There was, you couldn't vote, you couldn't speak your mind. Food, milk, all of that was rationed on the island. Um, in fact, the story I like to tell from time to time, when I was a toddler, I had a severe calcium deficiency. And the milk that the state offered us via ration program just wasn't enough. And my father turned to the black market, purchased 2 liters of milk, and for that he was thrown in prison.
Wow.
If you could imagine, for getting a sick
No,
child with a
no, you
calcium
can't. No.
deficiency, a couple of liters of milk. So that was the sort of the insanity of Cuba at that time. And sadly, it's only gotten worse. It really has only gotten worse. We were fortunate that my grandparents had fled Cuba with a small group of people they knew on a small boat. They sort of pushed from shore in the middle of the night, and they made it to the U.S. They were lost at sea for a few days. They were rescued by the Coast Guard, and being that era, they were brought to the U.S. and welcomed to the U.S. with open arms. They weren't returned to Cuba. So we had family here when we arrived, but like everybody else, we weren't allowed to take anything with us.
Hmm.
No possessions. All that you were allowed to leave the country with was one change of clothing in a suitcase. If they found any jewelry on you, any money, it was all confiscated at the airport. Or worse, you were told that you could no longer leave the country, and you had to stay. So yeah, in November of '67 began sort of part two of our existence, and the typical story, right? You had parents, and in my case, parents with limited education, with no next to no language skills. My father spoke a little bit of English, right?
Hmm.
Just enough to, hello, how are you, that sort of thing. Um, and my mom stayed at home, raised me, and my sister was born almost a year into our arrival. And my dad at the time worked 2 full-time jobs, 7 days.
And I'm sorry, you guys immigrated directly to, was it Miami at the time?
We arrived in Miami, and as I like to say, we had a cup of coffee here, right? We literally were here for like 1 or 2 days, and then we were reunited with my grandparents, who at the time were living in Hackensack, New Jersey.
Okay.
Yeah, and so
Got it.
yeah. Most Cubans of that era, we sort of break down into two groups: those that went and shoveled snow in New Jersey and New York and that area, and those that stayed here in Miami. But there was very little work in Miami at the time.
Okay. Got
Miami
it.
looked nothing at the time like it does today, this booming metropolis. You mentioned Miami today, and people are like, "Oh, Miami! Wow!" Like, nobody was saying that in 1967.
Okay. Right. Right. Right.
It was a sleepy
Absolutely.
town with no airport, basically. Yeah,
Got it. So, you arrive, let's say, in New Jersey. How old were you?
I was 5.
You were five.
I
Five.
was
Okay.
I was
So,
5.
yeah. So you did all your growing up in New Jersey, which explains your Springsteen fandom for sure.
There you go. There you go. The accent, the whole nine. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
for
yeah.
sure.
But I also had a leg up in a certain sense. One of these weird situations. We lived across the street from a grade school in
Hmm.
Havana. And at a very early age, I'd go missing from time to time, and my frantic mother would go out and search, and they'd find me sitting in the classroom in the school. And the principal came over and spoke to my parents. Said, "We're tired of having this kid come in and disrupt classes. Why don't we just put him in a kindergarten class? That's what he wants, right? Just put him in a kindergarten class." So by the time I arrived here at the age of 5, I was already in, I think it was like the second grade.
Got it.
So while I couldn't understand what was being spoken in class, my math skills were ahead of where they should have been, right? Some other skills that I picked up as the smallest kid in my class in Havana. So I wasn't left back. A lot of my friends were. A lot of my friends were
Hmm.
left back. And
Yeah, typical.
there were no English as a second language program at the time. So most educators thought that we were just dumb kids who needed to be put in special ed when in fact we just didn't understand the language, that's all.
Correct.
um, and typical of that young generation, I picked up on it pretty quickly, and like a lot of us, I became the one that would translate stuff for your parents, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, like business documents. I have such. I
Business
mean,
documents, yeah, yeah.
talking to customer service.
Bank, negotiating
Yeah,
a new car, right? I mean,
it's
all
crazy,
of
man.
that we had to do at a very young age, and I'm glad we're touching upon that because it's a theme that comes up over and over and over again in these thousands of stories that we've documented. You know, I spoke to a gentleman years ago who was a member of the L.A. City Council, and he said, I was sent home one day from school for quote unquote misbehaving. And it's just that I didn't understand what was being said. And I was asking the kid next to me. And I think he was 5 years old at the time, same age as I was when I arrived. And he said, on my way home, I crossed the street, being a 5-year-old kid, I didn't know what I was doing. I got hit by a car
Right.
and broke my leg in several places.
Eesh.
He said, and I remember being at the hospital, my mom showing up, and I'm there in pain, and I've got to translate for the doctor what my prognosis is. That was my first taste. I remember him telling me that was my first taste of the fragility of the immigrant experience. How
Yeah.
helpless my mom must have felt with a 5-year-old kid being the one explaining what's going on as he's literally the patient.
Right.
So these are the things that made us all grow up and become sort of men and women at a very young age. You know, um,
Very, very true.
we looked at life through a different sort of prism. I don't think we had a chance to enjoy the sort of a life with zero responsibility of kids our age who happen to have been born here.
Correct. Correct. And it's funny that you would say it like that because it's sort of precisely why I'm actually doing this podcast, and why I'm calling it Tell Me Más. Just
Right.
because, yeah, I mean, different to you, I was born here, born and raised here to South American parents from Peru and Chile. And but it's undeniable that I do view the world with the additional filter of being, Latino. And
Of course.
it's so interesting that we hear so much, like we were just mentioning earlier, about Latinos and news and politics around that identity. I just think it's not covered enough, and when it is, it's oftentimes inaccurate because yes, indeed, our identity and the way we grew up affects every aspect of our life. So for example, the things that we didn't get exposed to: financial planning, career advice. I mean, our dads just found the best job they could, and if they can get 10 cents more an hour, a quarter more an hour, boom, you make that switch. No one was talking about how to get promoted and how to climb the corporate ladder. We weren't given that sort of
No,
advice.
that was never part of our reality. I mean, I can tell you from a personal experience, I you know, long after graduating from college and working in an office in New York, I think I was already had been promoted to vice president of a radio group. And if I was going to, if I was in conversation with my parents and friends and we were speaking Spanish, I would often catch myself if I had to go into work on a Saturday, for example. What came out of my mouth was, "I've got to go to the factory." It was never an office because I never heard anyone going to an office when I was growing up. My parents and all their friends, they all worked in factories. So factory is where you worked. So I would catch myself all the time. No, tengo que ir a la factoría el sábado. And dude, you don't work in a factory. You work in an office,
Yeah. Yeah.
But those were the things. But, I think those things served us well because I never took for granted the fact that I had the privilege of working in an air conditioned environment.
Yeah.
Right. I never took that for granted.
Right.
And I still don't, even though I'm sitting out here
Yeah.
sweating my ass off on my balcony talking to you, right? Normally,
Yeah,
normally
exactly.
these days we live in air conditioning. But those are the little things,
It really is.
and that I think you need to hang on to, right? I think those are the things you need to hang on to. You can't really truly be yourself and shut that off and forget that was, who you were, right? I think that just makes
And
us,
where you came from, and that you're
yeah,
you're you're
yeah.
oftentimes you're oftentimes one generation away from, or one or two life decisions away from having had that exact existence, working outside to this day in the heat.
Absolutely, absolutely. We tend to look at our. I mean, in American society in general, you tend to look at yourself as being self-made, right?
Yeah.
Um, Man, I can't tell you how many people arrived here like my parents with the best intentions, and you give birth to a special needs child, and there's no way you're going to be in the same situation my parents are 20, 30 years later, right?
Correct.
The amount of work they had to put in order to take care of that child, the amount of resources and time and effort that went into that, um, really hold you back as a family, right? So to say, "Oh, I'm self-made," no, 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 no. We had a lot of,
Yeah.
we may have not started compared to a lot of people at the same starting line, but man, we could have been further back. We could
Oh
have
yeah.
been really pushed back further with a simple diagnosis at the doctor, with a simple setback, and we need to be thankful for all of it. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely, we do, man. Yeah. So yeah, I really want to talk about this latest crazy project of yours. It's called Voces del Siete de Octubre, correct? In
Right. Yeah.
Spanish?
Mhm.
Man, so yeah, October 7th, it's so interesting because it feels like just yesterday at this point, but it's been quite a while now, and it's certainly one of those historic moments that I think will live on and in infamy forever. I think it's my kids' generation 9/11 for sure. Um, it absolutely shocking, and what the result has been thus far on that actual day. About, I believe, 1,200 Israelis killed, well over, I believe it's 150 taken hostage at this point. 38,000, Palestinians from Gaza killed in the war. But you decide or figure out a way to document that whole story from a Latino perspective. And I'll be honest, when I first heard about it, I don't know why, and this is my own ignorance, but obviously the Jewish community in Latin America is quite large and expansive. And I have been part of that society and culture for a very long time, and absolutely have contributed in nothing but positive ways. I just wasn't really aware, in by any stretch, of Latinos living in Israel. So, you know, I'd love to hear all about that project, how it came about, and sort of what you learned from that.
Yeah, well, I was as surprised by that fact as you are. Right, I had no idea that there was a sizable Latino population in Israel. And I want to say it was early December of last year. I had a group reach out to me who knew about the Immigrant Archive Project somehow. And they sent me an email letting me know that there was a young woman, actually a woman. I didn't know she was young. A woman that survived the October 7th terrorist attacks, and she was going to be in Miami. She was Venezuelan, so she was an immigrant, and they wanted to know if I was open to interviewing her. And I said, "Oh my gosh, yes." I hadn't pictured Latinos caught up in what happened on October 7th. So I sort of walked into this blind, right? I all I knew is what I just shared with you now. So I didn't really have a
Hmm.
chance to sit and prepare many questions. I walked in blind. When I walked into the room, I came face to face with this young woman named Sharon Trusman, who literally could be physically could be twins with my middle daughter Sarah.
Oh
Uh,
wow.
yeah, even the same age, right? Boy, so the similarities were just uncanny. So that struck me right away. And when we sat down, and she began sharing her story, I understood that she had survived the Nova Festival attack. She was at Nova with a group of friends, and she proceeded to share her story with me over the course of about an hour. I think I had with her, and then off camera, I asked her about the Latino community. If she was like a one off. If I said, "Oh, no, 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 no. There's a sizable Latino community, and not just Venezolano, from
Hmm.
Argentina and Chile and Brazil and Mexico and from all over." So as she was telling me this, Vic, I literally began picturing this documentary that I'm piecing together right now. Um, telling the stories. These are immigrant stories, and their perspectives of having survived this horrific terrorist attack. So I mentioned my. It sort of started to consume me, right? And I mentioned it to a friend of mine over at the Knight Foundation, and she said, you really need to talk to a woman named Leah Soibel over at Fuente Latina about
I'm
this.
sorry. The Knight Foundation. What group is that?
The Knight Foundation, they own Knight Ritter at one point, the newspaper chain which owned the
Okay.
Miami Herald and so forth and so on.
Okay. Got it.
And
Got
they
it.
since spun that off. They created the Knight Foundation. It's all about, I mean, they're involved in a number of things. Their main mission is sort of integrity in journalism, right?
Okay.
And we had been in talks about us producing a series of Cuban immigrant stories, Cuban refugee stories for them here in Miami. And in conversation, I brought up the fact that I had just interviewed this woman and so forth. So she was kind enough to send an email out to Leah, connecting me. And maybe a week later, we met for coffee. I shared a snippet of that interview. And what Fuente Latina does, it's a nonprofit based here in Miami, and they disseminate news in Spanish out of Israel to the
Out of
U.S.
Israel.
and throughout Latin America for the simple reason that Univision, Telemundo, Clarín, Televisa, they don't have bureaus, news bureaus in Tel Aviv, in Israel. So they sort of provide the feeds, they provide access. Um, she liked the idea, and we both decided to go on this journey together. And my team and I, we co-produced it with her. So it's my camera crew. Excuse me. We worked with a very talented young field producer in Israel that works with Leah, a young Colombian Jewish cat named Harry Toledo, which to me always sounded like a character in an old film noir movie,
Sounds
right?
like a detective.
Yeah, 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 yeah. And Harry's probably equal parts Colombian and Israeli at this point, right?
Wow.
So he talks to me with the same adorable Colombian accent that every Colombian friend of mine here in
Of
Miami has.
course.
He grew up in Colombia and emigrated as a young man, and he's married to an Israeli young woman. They have a beautiful family there, and he was just terrific at reaching out and sort of connecting me with this Latino community in Israel. So we spent the latter part of no, not the latter part of December. I'd say the early weeks in January, conducting Zoom calls back to
Okay.
back, probably starting at 6 o'clock in the morning, given their time difference, right? With a number of individuals, and then we settled on, I believe it was slightly over 40 stories that
40.
we would document. And January 25th, my team and I land in Tel Aviv, and then we spend about a month traveling the country from one corner to the other, um, documenting stories of folks who came under attack in their communities, the majority of them being kibbutzim along the southern border. Um, Young people who survived, who were at the festival attack, the Nova Festival attack. Um, Folks
So
who
everyone you interviewed was directly affected by the attack.
Uh, yes and no. There was one gentleman that I interviewed who he's the president of this group called Olay. His name is Mario Lev. And what Olay does is it's a nonprofit organization that welcomes immigrants from Latin America to Israel.
Okay.
So he provided a little bit of that backstory, right? How long have they been migrating into
Okay.
Israel? What is that process, right? So he sort of served in a sort of professorial role explaining the history. Um, Another gentleman wasn't necessarily present at the kibbutzim or at the festival, but his name is Dr. Ricardo Nachman, and he's the lead forensic pathologist in Israel. So it's him and his team that had to take these bodies in and understand what the cause of death uh,
Okay.
was for all of them. So he had a very, very dark job, but a first-hand look at the atrocities committed that day. And his interview was just fascinating.
Yeah, and that's something that I definitely wanted to ask you about, because having seen and spoken to these folks firsthand, I feel like there's still to this day so much misinformation, or I think a lot of people here on this side that are keeping up with the story and what happened. It's just so hard to understand exactly, every fact behind of the attacks and what happened. And now, I mean, you just don't know what sources to go to for, that absolute clear information. Being the fact that you went there firsthand and actually spoke to these victims, what did you kind of learn about that aspect of it? About the actual crimes that existed.
Let's take a step back and we'll get into the crimes in a sec. The first thing that jumped out at me was that the folks that I would interview, those who emigrated from Latin America, arrived in Israel for the same reasons Latino immigrants arrive in the United States, right? You interviewed a young girl who fell in love with an Israeli visiting Colombia, and she followed her heart, right? How many stories haven't we heard of
Sure,
people who come
of
here
course.
because they, whatever. Others who we're in Argentina, for example, and the economy in Argentina, as we know, has been a
Hmm.
bit of a roller coaster ride, right? So it was, look, I had no future in Argentina, and here's an opportunity to start a new life, right? So my takeaway was that the reasons for emigrating were not very dissimilar at all to the reasons why your family and my family are here. Some fleeing political persecution,
Hmm.
religious persecution, which is the same reason why countless families, including mine, are here. So that was sort of the first takeaway. Um, the second was these attacks, for the most part, were perpetrated upon a particularly politically liberal community
In the kibbutz, correct?
in the kibbutzim and at the festival. When you talk to these kids, when you see, you know, these for the most part are freedom loving, young. Imagine a snapshot of Burning Man, okay? That Burning Man
Right.
crowd, right? It's the same crowd. It's the
So
same.
it's not this ultra Zionist, ultra right sort of group that
No,
indeed exists, but that's not who I think those people represented for sure.
that's not the that's not the base of victims. Most of these kibbutzim, they're socialist communities. You
Which I
know,
didn't know. I had never heard the term before then, and I didn't know that these communities existed or what they were all about.
I knew very little about them going in, and sort of, I took a 101 perspective, right? So explain to me what life is like on a kibbutzim. And it was fascinating. First of all, you're a partner in the community,
Uh-huh.
right? So you own a share of the community, but you don't really own anything. The home you live in is not yours. Um, the cars that they drive, at least in the kibbutzim that I visited, uh, didn't belong to anyone in
Mm-hmm.
particular. They've got this fascinating app, and they've got this fleet of cars. So if Vic needs to go visit the dentist, right? You go into your app, and it's just you for a dental appointment. So maybe you rent out a Mini Cooper that you can drive out to the dentist, right? Now, if you need to go pick up lumber for some reason, you're putting a deck
Mm-hmm.
out on the back of your house, then you reserve an SUV or a pickup truck. They have literally a slew of vehicles. And I was picked up in one of these vehicles, and I was surprised. I mean, it's cleaner than they were cleaner than your average Uber X, right? So they take
Wow.
really good care of these vehicles. So it's a different existence. And the thinking is, you contribute to your
Mm-hmm.
ability, and you receive based on your needs.
Ah, very cool. Very Marxian.
Very Marxian, and coming
Yeah.
from a Cuban dude who
Yeah,
fled,
exactly.
right? Who fled that.
Yeah.
I'm saying, wait a second, but unlike unlike the society that I fled, if you disagree with it, you're free to leave. You're free to leave. Listen,
Yeah.
you can move out of the kibbutzim and find something else. You're not thrown in prison. Nobody's knocking down your door. No
Right.
one is telling you that you can't give your kid an extra liter of milk, or we're going to throw you in prison, right? I mean, this is it. It works.
Yeah. And it's clearly based on pure intentions versus using socialism to just simply control and,
Correct.
never let go of power. Yeah, that's a whole
Correct.
different thing for sure.
Correct. 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 So and they literally are right up on the border with Gaza.
Hmm.
I think the first interview I conducted um, with this gentleman, we sat down, and I could literally hear, the gunfire and the explosions going off in the background. I think at that point we were a mile and a half, 2 miles away from the fighting. So you realize how and why they were overrun so quickly, right? It's not a
Correct.
very long stretch to go from Gaza to where they lived. Yeah.
Got it. Um, so remind me how many folks you actually got to speak to?
On camera, I'd say 41, 42.
41, 42.
Yeah. Yeah. And they were, they
What
were, they
what
were all Latino, except for one gentleman, Israeli, whose partner, his life partner, was a young Colombian woman, was at the festival. He decided to stay home with their son. He's a little bit older than she is, doesn't dig that kind of music,
mhm.
his thing. Um, and just as a brief little teaser, because all these, I mean, every single story is just incredibly compelling. She found herself under attack, um, and made a phone call to him in Tel Aviv, and he literally dropped his son off at a friend's house and drove down an hour and a half in the hopes of finding her at the festival and rescuing her. And he'd been with her long enough that his Spanish was good enough that he could share his story on camera with us in
Okay,
Spanish, and he was kind enough to do so. And it was just a very unique perspective.
got
Um,
it. So of these Latinos, they're not all necessarily Jewish, right? Because you were mentioning some immigrated from Latin America, and they're not necessarily Jewish.
no, no, no. I spoke to a Mexican guy named Luis Cruz, who owns Tacos Luis, which, believe it or not, is this banging taco stand in Jerusalem, right? So he's like
How funny.
surrounded with all this history, all of these
Yeah.
sacred stones and these, and there he is, and he's killing it. And I asked him, I mean, like, you're a Mexican dude with a taco stand. Why not New York, right? Why not Miami, somewhere else? He's like, nah, man, I had a taco stand in Union City, New Jersey,
Hmm.
which blew me out of the water because that's where my family moved after doing a 1 year
Okay.
stint in Hackensack. I mean, I think his taco spot and where we lived was, maybe 10 blocks away.
Oh wow.
And he fell in love with an Israeli woman, and he moved, and they've got this wonderful restaurant in Jerusalem now, and the food was insane. The food was just absolutely delicious, and I guess it's kosher tacos that you can have there.
Absolutely. And I mean, there's nowhere in the world that you now cannot find a good taco. I mean, I'll be honest, and everybody loves it. Well, I mean, except New York City. New
It's
York City continues to not really have good enough Mexican food for sure.
well,
Absolutely.
it's not because there's a shortage of Mexicans in New York City.
No, no, exactly. Exactly. So, tell me the story about there was, I forgot, you mentioned a story about a woman who didn't even speak, she didn't speak very much Hebrew, right? An older woman that communicated through Spanish with these terrorists knocking on her door.
Yeah, yeah. Her name is Esther Cunyo, and Esther Cunyo's a 90-year-old woman. And we kind of stumbled upon her story. It was one of these happy accidents.
Mhm.
Um, you may have seen a photo. There was a photo circulating around. Terrorists broke into her home, and for some reason, they gave her, I think it was an AK-47, put it in her lap, made a peace sign, and took a photo with this old lady, and and they left. I saw that photo before I went to Israel, and I thought it was, one of these terrorists who went back home and was celebrating along with his grandmother. That was my take when I saw the
Mhm.
photo, because they didn't offer any context. I interviewed her daughter-in-law, and as the interview wrapped up, we're looking through some pictures, and she says, "Oh, this is my mother-in-law. You may recall she's the one who." I said, "Wait a second, I saw that photo. That's your mother-in-law." "Yeah." I said, "Okay, I need to talk to your mother-in-law." And she was
Mhm.
kind enough to ring her, and a couple of days later, we found ourselves in her new living room, because she can't go back to her home. And she told us a story, and basically what happened was she was home alone, and heard a knock on the door, and opened the door. There's nobody there. Had no idea that her neighborhood was overrun by terrorists at that point. Her hearing isn't necessarily the best. And later, a little later that morning, they broke a window in her home. She looked through the window. She saw two terrorists looking in. "Where's your front door?" So, "What are you doing breaking my window? What's wrong with you guys?" She still had no idea. "My door's over here, but look at the mess you've made." And these
I can
guys,
hear it.
and they said, "You need to come with us." I said,
Mhm.
"You? What do you mean go with you? And go? I can barely walk. Go with you? You're out of your mind. Where's your family? What family? I live here alone. We want to know where your family is. Take a look. There's nobody here." And they looked around. Sure enough, there was nobody there. They insisted she go with them, and she spoke perfect Hebrew, by the way.
Oh, she did. Okay.
But she's a very, very sharp woman. And she said, "Look, you know what? Don't even talk to me. I barely speak Hebrew. I don't speak your language, Arabic. I speak Spanish. I'm from Argentina. You know Argentina?" The guy's like, "Argentina? What do you mean Argentina?" She
Now
goes,
hold
"You
on.
like football?"
She's 90 years old. She she
She
immigrated to
emigrated
Israel
from Argentina.
how many long time ago, I assume.
She emigrated from Argentina as a full-grown woman. I want to say she emigrated in
Okay.
the 80s.
Okay, got it.
So
Got
she
it.
didn't emigrate as a young kid,
Okay.
Um, and she had the clarity of mind to pull the Messi card. He said, "You like soccer? Yeah, well, you know what? I'm from where Messi's from. You like Messi? I'm from where Messi. Oh my God, we like Messi. Are you kidding me? Oh wow." Gave her the AK-47. They take a snapshot like two teenage kids taking a selfie. And these certified killers literally walked out. I interviewed her daughter-in-law. And as the interview wrapped up, we're looking through some pictures. And she says, "Oh, this is my mother-in-law. You may recall she's the one who." I said, "Wait a second, I saw that photo. That's your mother-in-law." "Yeah." I said, "Okay, I need to talk to your mother-in-law." And she was
Mhm.
kind enough to ring her, and a couple of days later, we found ourselves in her new living room, because she can't go back to her home. And she told us a story. Israel es un país hermoso, con playas, restaurantes, paisajes desérticos y una historia sumamente complicada. Estamos acá, viajando por el país de un extremo al otro, con el fin de documentar los eventos que desencadenaron una guerra, los ataques de Hamás del 7 de octubre. Y estamos documentando el día más oscuro del país a través de los relatos en primera persona de la curiosamente grande comunidad de inmigrantes latinos.
Siento que me golpean la puerta, pero pa, pa, pa. Eran dos. Y me dice, ¿dónde está tu familia? Yo no tengo familia, le digo acá. Soy yo sola. Vos venís conmigo. Acá no va a haber gente. Va a estar todo fuego. No me hables, le digo, porque yo tu idioma no lo sé, el árabe. Y yo el hebreo hablo mal, le digo. Yo hablo en Argentina, en castellano. Entonces me dice, ¿qué es Argentina? Entonces le digo, ¿vos mirás fútbol? Y entonces me dice, sí, fútbol me gusta. Entonces le digo, yo soy de donde es Messi. Entonces él me contesta, ¿Messi? A mí me gusta Messi. Me agarró así del brazo, acá, y nos sacaron la foto.
Y si pudiera hacerle un pedido directamente a Messi,
Sí.
¿qué le dijeras?
Si él sabe que yo lo mencioné y por él me salvé, ahora le pediría por mis nietos, por mis dos nietos que están ahí encerrados. No los podemos sacar. Uno David y otro Ariel, Cuño.
It is, just so profoundly shaking just to understand what that day was like, the amount of victims that were taken, that are still hostages that have yet to be freed. And, unfortunately, we see ourselves in a moment where it almost feels like a stalemate, and I, I, I want to be hopeful. I want to be hopeful that this thing will end very soon. And that, the dying finally comes to an end, because and I don't know, I'm not a political strategist. I don't know every last detail of the negotiations, but yeah, it's the dying has to stop. It's too much is too much. Were they hope?
It's a brutal situation, right? And just to be very, very clear, I didn't set out to create a documentary litigating, the
Right.
unrest in the Middle East, right? That predates me, and I suspect it'll continue on long after I'm gone. Um, so that wasn't our intent. Our intent was to document what happened one day in history, right? And the first thing we need to do, I think, in order to really look at this calmly and understand it for what it was, is we need to put context around it and be able to give this dimension, right? The Nova Festival attack alone, just the attack on the concert, okay, that was about a third of the deaths that day. It accounted for
Mhm.
about a third of the deaths.
Okay.
So when you extrapolate just the Nova numbers, it exceeds that of the 15 biggest mass shootings in American history. So if you add Columbine and you add the Las Vegas
Vegas, right?
concert shooting, if you throw in the one here in Florida
Mhm.
at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, you add all of these mass shootings that we've had, the top 15 have less casualties than Nova alone. And that was only one
One
third
third.
of what happened that day.
It's a
And
9/11 attack. It's a 9/11
it,
level attack. There's no
it really
getting
is,
around that.
but it really isn't the 9/11 level attack, because when you take a look at, I was floored by how small Israel really is. And it just speaks to my ignorance, right? I had no idea that it had a sizable Latino population. I'd never visited Israel before. This was my
Hmm.
first time in Israel.
Neither fine.
Man, I'd be claustrophobic living in that country. You know, um, it's smaller than the state of Florida.
Hmm.
You can go from the northern tip to the southern tip in less time than it takes me to drive to Jacksonville, Florida from here. Okay.
Wow.
And east to west, I think it may be an hour and a half drive. That is it.
Man.
That is it. So when you equate it with a 9/11, for that attack to be on par with a 9/11, we would have had to have lost anywhere between 40,000 and 50,000 Americans that day.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah. So when people say, "Oh, it's a 9/11," oh no, 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 no.
Yeah.
It's 9/11 to times 10, 20. It was that
Yeah.
it was that horrific. And unlike 9/11, this was extremely personal, right? 9/11 was sort of done from afar, right? Planes that crashed and came in. Here it was personal. It was people dragged out of their beds, and burned alive, and shot and tortured and raped. Um, Defenseless kids at a concert. They just walked in, and it was the Hunger Games. Um, it was human hunting on a very, very personal, very, very wide, broad level.
Man, truly sickening. Truly sickening. Some of those stories must keep you up at night sometimes.
Here's the thing, man. To spend a month, right, where every day you're talking to people that witnessed that and are kind enough and open enough to understand the importance of that moment in history and the importance of documenting their experience, and they're reliving it with you. You know, in order for you to do an effective job as an interviewer, as with any interview, you've got to be on that journey with them. You can't disconnect yourself. I understand when a surgeon operates an 8-year-old child, he can't approach it as though he's operating his 8-year-old child. He needs to be removed from it. But in the case of an interview, you can't be removed from it.
Right.
You can't. Because if they sense that you're removed from it, then what's the sense in speaking to you? I'm going to be very sort of surface level, and I'm not going to let you in because, you haven't proved yourself worthy of letting you in. you know
Right.
so you have to go on that journey, and it was the most soul crushing, um, devastating experience. There were days where I'd find crew members, and I'm talking about hardened dudes, right, crying, literally sobbing. And it's okay. It's all right. What we just heard was someone explained to us how his daughter was burned alive in his community, and he could do nothing about it, right?
Man.
And how they prayed to God that their children were kidnapped, and in fact, 14 days later, they were able to recognize enough of their remains to say that they had been burned beyond
Man.
recognition. They know that was them. And those are the stories that you hear 3, 4, 5 times a day over a month.
Man, and those stories, you're absolutely right, have to be told. They have to be captured because for those of us separated from it, from our comfortable little couches, you know, f- while we watch the news, we hear numbers, right? We hear casualty numbers. Casualty numbers do not represent uh, human stories, human lives, and you forget. It's very easy to just make it all about the numbers and try to make it a sort of a cold analysis, but it's not. These are human beings, each with their own little life, that had nothing to do, instigated nothing. We're simply living their lives and have it transformed in such a dark and sort of sinister manner is truly shocking.
It's appalling. It's appalling. It's appalling. And we need to be aware of that extremism that exists out there. You mentioned 9/11. It's sort of the same kind of thinking. Bataclan in France.
Hmm.
It's the same sort of thinking. And there were plenty of victims caught up in that weren't Jewish.
Yeah.
that weren't Israeli, that were Mexicans, that were Argentinians, that were Chileans, that were Brazilians, that had no skin in that game, were Buddhists, were one of the largest groups of hostages are from Argentina. Another very large group of hostages, believe it or not, were from Thailand.
Really? Thailand?
Yeah, and I couldn't understand why. And it was explained to me that Thai out there are, for some reason, the ones that do field work, sort of the agricultural work, right? And a lot of these kibbutzim along the Gaza border are agricultural communities, a lot of farming. And many of them were either killed or taken hostage.
Man.
Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you what, no one better than you to actually capture those stories and bring them to life. I'm confident that those interviews are just going to be as good as every one of the IAP stories, that even if those IAP stories don't necessarily involve war and death, I mean, they never never fail to, get me a little welled up and put a frog in my throat. What's the timeline or distribution of these stories? When can we expect to see that widely distributed?
My partners at Fuente Latina are working on distribution as we speak. My team and I and a member of their team, we're in post right now, so we're busy putting this together. It's a very large undertaking. I suspect it'll be between 3 and 4 episodes, more than likely 4, each about an hour long. So it's it's a real docuseries. There's no way of boiling this thing down into a 1 hour piece, right? At least not without betraying the trust of the people that came to the camera and not doing the story justice. I think the story needs to be told from a number of different angles, different perspectives, different sort of experts weighing in, and we've done that, and we've and I can proudly say that we've done it in Spanish, which I thought was very, very important. There's very little information about what happened here, first person in Spanish. Very
absolutely.
And these are universal stories. It'll be subtitled, and if you don't speak Spanish, you don't understand Spanish.
Perfect.
You can still enjoy the the series by following with subtitles.
Great, and let's hope that by that time, this war is ended, and we can simply mourn all those losses and hopefully never see anything like this again.
Amen.
Brother, thank you so much for taking the time. Really appreciate it. I'm excited about this project, and want to thank you for doing it, for undertaking it and doing it only the way you know how.
Thank you, my dude. I appreciate that, and I want to wish you a lot of luck with your podcast. I think it's a wonderful idea.
I appreciate it, man.
This very enjoyable conversation is any glimpse of what lies ahead. I suspect it'll be very, very successful. Not based on anything that I've shared with you, but just simply the way you conduct the conversation, and you get your guests to open up and connect with you on a very human level. So kudos to you and
appreciate it.
Success, absolutely.
All right, brother. I appreciate it.
Okay, people. Se te quiere.
Un abrazo. Chao.
Se hizo una fiesta por la paz y en esa fiesta hubo una cacería humana. Fue eso, como en las peores películas, ¿sí? del cine, donde uno ve esos
Hunger Games.
Exactamente.
Llegamos como a las 3 de la mañana. Todo estaba perfecto, pero yo sentía algo que no estaba bien. A las 7:30 que empezamos a correr, hasta las 8, que ya sentí que me iba a morir, sentí que me iban a matar, porque ya yo veía gente muriéndose, o sea, gente que estaba matando atrás mío, y, o sea, era un caos total. O sea, todo era una situación de vida o muerte de segundos.
Pero cuando yo intenté correr, habían cuerpos y yo no quería pisarlos. Y eran gente que ni siquiera tenían rostros. Empezamos a ver a todos nuestros amigos colgados de los árboles. Desmembraron a las niñas, desmembraron a los chicos, había muchas chicas desnudas. Era como el holocausto.